But liberalism itself does not have powerful tools for generating solidarity. And I believe we live in a time when the crisis is not lack of freedom, although that certainly occurs in some instances. The big crisis, the meta crisis of our time, is one of disintegration. And in a time of disintegration, you have to turn to whatever provides solidarity. And it's not going to be, the sources for that are not going to be within liberalism. A strong culture of freedom requires people who are profoundly loyal to higher truths, because that gives them the power to say, no, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to accept this. We want to celebrate difference, but we want to neutralize it as much as possible.
Concepts with Shawn Whatley.
Welcome to Concepts. My name is Shawn Whatley. Today I was excited to have Rusty Reno with us. He's the editor of First Things magazine. He's a background as a political philosopher and theologian. He's taught in university for 20 years. He's an avid rock climber. I didn't know that. That came out in our interview, and he wanted to mention that right up front, so that was really neat. And then he's obviously a very successful author. Our conversation focused on three things today, and I want to mention them up front. We looked at his books, A Return of the Strong Gods, Nationalism, Populism, and the Future of the West. Essential book. Buy it, read it. Even if you disagree with it, you need to have it on your shelf. But it ties in with a discussion also of post-liberalism. In Canada, it seems like we're holding back. No one's really jumping in and saying, I am a post-liberal and this is what I think. Post-liberalism has branched out into several different varieties. So we talk about a taxonomy of post-liberalism. What are some of the ideas that are included in it? And then we tie that into our third point, which is the multiculturalism debate or laïcité going on in Quebec. I try to pull out Professor Reno's ideas on this. He wouldn't take the bait when I asked him to differentiate the differences between a Catholic political theology and Protestant political theology, and how maybe we could use that as a test case to understanding the complexity in our political presuppositions in a multicultural society. I tried several different ways, and he's far too smart. He said, nah, I'm not really sure that's the issue that's going on here. But he was generous and dove into that as much as prudence would allow. I hope you get an opportunity to listen through this whole thing. Rusty Reno is someone that you need to be reading, you need to be listening to. He offers incredible insight into what's going on politically, but also what's going on in our society and with respect to religion and faith traditions. Fascinating guy, tremendous privilege to have him on, and just really a nice person too. I really enjoyed our conversation. So again, you know what I'm going to say, click, like, and subscribe. And those of you who have been leaving comments, thank you so much. They're really helpful. Even the negative ones, love to hear them and love to start a discussion. So anyways, let's get on with the show. Welcome, Rusty Reno.
Glad to be with you, Shawn.
Great. I appreciate you making the time. And on behalf of all your fans in my audience, but also across Canada, it's a real pleasure to have you here.
It's funny, by the way, that I made many trips to Canada. I'm a broken down old rock climber and mountain climber, and I cannot count the number of trips I've made to the Canadian Rockies and to Alberta, British Columbia. So,
wow,
profound fondness for Canada.
Thanks for bringing that in. I saw it in one of your bios that you're an avid rock climber, and I thought, is there a way to bring that in? But so I appreciate you bringing that up.
More elegant in spirit at age 66 than I am in terms of what I can actually do at this point. It's one of my friends said, we're still out there with less horsepower.
Yeah. So that's it's modest of you to say that, but I think if you and I tried to climb even the simplest embankment, you would very quickly realize you're still an expert. Anyways, so with your permission, and I've already got your permission on this, I want to cover three topics in this episode because I think they're all linked. And the topics are, we're going to introduce your book. I think a lot of people will already know it, but I'll get you to comment on that. Then we talk about post-liberalism. And then we want to talk about the multiculturalism and secularism debate going on right now in Quebec. And I think you have particular insights that will be helpful, not just for the audience in Canada, but also in America and beyond. So let's start with Return of the Strong Gods, Nationalism, Populism, and the Future of the West. You published it in
Rather grandiose subtitle, isn't it?
Awesome.
The
Yeah,
Future of the West. Yes.
that's right. Well, anyways, I don't think it's grandiose, but that's good of you to say. So 2019, you published this the exact same year that Quebec tabled its Bill 21 on laïcité, on secularism. So they tie in perfectly. You released it again in 2021 with a new update. So I want you to talk about your book. I'm going to read a quote, and then I'll get you to talk about it and say whether or not you would have changed anything. So we're jumping in at page 29 under the post-war consensus, and you say this, quote, "In the aftermath of worldwide depression, fascism, global war, and the rising threat of Soviet totalitarianism, the mainstream of America's leadership class adopted the views of Karl Popper and Friedrich Hayek. The post-war reconstruction of the West, they believed, required not the old pieties and time-honored truths, but an entirely new mentality, one immune from the temptation of dogma of any sort. So skepticism took priority over belief, the spirit of suspicion and critique over faith and piety. The true threats were now seen to be strong truth claims, metaphysical formulations, and appeals to the transcendent. The contents of beliefs matters, of course, but of more concern is the firmness with which they are held." End quote. Explain.
I still think that for most people, that's the consensus view, that we need to carry our convictions lightly. So the whole diversity and inclusion language, they're both a kind of making, but both your worldview and your community more porous, more open, less rigid. So a lot of the praise words of our time connote that element of openness, creativity and innovation. These are praise words. As I already noted, diversity was for a couple of decades an extremely strong praise word. So it's always interesting if you're a cultural critic and you're examining the patient, like the doctor takes your blood pressure, one thing that you should do as a cultural critic is, what are the praise words? What are the words that human resource departments use to evoke for employees or customers a kind of positive feelings? And I think our praise words over the last generation have been all key to this notion of the open society, the open mind.
Yeah, no, I like your use of that concept, praise words. It reminds me of a phenomenological approach where we just come and look at the patient. What do we see there? What is the patient telling us? And maybe that's evoking some of your Heideggerian background. I don't know. We won't try to bring in Heidegger. But go ahead.
Richard Weber, he's a literary critic, but best known in American circles as a conservative writer. He used the term God terms. And God terms are the ones that people don't feel they need to justify. In fact, they serve as justification. So, democracy, that was a very strong God term in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, but I don't think it's such a strong God term anymore. I think diversity, openness, inclusion, these are more prominent as God terms starting in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah. No, I love Weaver. Of course, his Ideas Have Consequences being, I think, his most famous book. The concern I have with Ideas Have Consequences, first of all, it really resonates with me. But then I also have to admit that sometimes consequences don't have any ideas. They just happen. So they're events and not consequences. But your concept of weakening, and you've already introduced it. So again, page 91, your chapter, Weakening as Destiny. And I like this kind of a phrase, quote, the rhetoric of weakening dovetails with the neoliberal economic and cultural project of porous borders and infinite fluidity, a restless utopianism that is always looking for another boundary to overcome, as the present mania for transgenderism demonstrates, end quote. And just before you respond to that, you're going to have to explain the word neoliberal, because a lot of my libertarian friends in the finance world, they say, oh, Shawn, that's just a swear word. It has no content. So unpack that word neoliberal and then tell us, or dilate if you wish, on this rhetoric of weakening. Perhaps you've already talked about the rhetoric of weakening, but how do you tie that to neoliberalism? Go ahead.
It is, I sympathize with people who roll their eyes when you use the term neoliberal. It's a plastic notion, but it seems unavoidable. Why? Partly it connotes the way that the American left, epitomized by the Clinton administration, from 92 to 2000, reconciled itself to the Reagan Revolution and promised to voters it would sustain it in a kind of Jekyll fashion. It also connotes the way in which the global economy, the rules-based international order, was a bipartisan project. Again, very important that the American left signed on to the ambition to create a global marketplace. And then in a different sphere, it connotes the way in which our economic consensus accepted the Hayekian principle that markets are absolutely indispensable as a way of communicating information about what consumers want and what investors should invest in. But that was then surrounded by a consensus, or surrounded by macroeconomic monetary policy and so forth. And so it was not command and control a la socialism, but rather a fusion of technocratic management of the economy with macroeconomic factors, where you had, and inside that management was an ideal of the pre-market on the exchange. So I think it's a meaningful term, neoliberalism, because it's the uniparty, the left-right consensus. It's, there's not a scintilla of difference between Justin Trudeau and whomever the conservative adversary was when it came to those questions. And that's a huge change from, the pre-70s political environment, where, you had nationalization of key industries in England after the election of the Labour government at the end of World War II. Just unimaginable by the time you get to the 1990s. That is a solution to economic inequality or what have you. So I think it's a meaningful term. It's a useful term to describe that historical transition. And, in terms of that consensus was the left reconciling itself to what I would call creative destruction, reconciling itself to the way in which capitalism is a transformative force in not just economically, but socially as well. And this dovetailed with a growing consensus, again, left-right. Republicans we were going to have a more open, more fluid, less judgmental society, but people on the right, are going to protect religious freedom and maybe not do it so rapidly and so aggressively. And the left said, we're going to do economic globalization, which is going to transform the economies of our country, but we're going to protect you, the worker, by, I don't know, union support for unionization, or in the Clinton administration, money for vocational retooling so everybody can become a computer programmer. And in fact, I think we look back on the 90s, and that was the beginning of everybody's going to go to college. And that was, I think, an effort. They foresaw that economic globalization was going to undermine the industrial basis for middle-class prosperity, industrial jobs. But they had hoped that they could retool the median American as a successful member of a morning service economy. It didn't work out that way. As we know, populism, by the time you get to Trump in 2016, the discontent, both with the project of cultural openness and the project of economic openness, has risen. And immigration is where the two come together. If you read the Wall Street Journal editorial page, we've got to have immigration in order to maintain a dynamic economy, and you have to have open borders, the free flow of goods, capital, and labor. That's an ideal of the kind of free market right. And then the left, immigration represents an opportunity to build a new multicultural society for the first time in human history, to usher in a new future where we will be citizens of the world. So I think I think it's easy to see that left-right fusion. I've described it in political terms. In the book, I describe it in intellectual terms in that chapter and in the previous chapter. The way in which Karl Popper, who's thought to be he was a man of the left, and Friedrich Hayek, who is thought to be a man of the right, they're both complicated figures, and they're not immediately completely categorizable in that regard. Interestingly, Hayek wrote an essay he gave at Mount Pelerin Society, Why I Am Not a Conservative. And Popper, who was one of the founding members of the Mount Pelerin Society, resigned because he didn't think it reflected his own social democrat views. So they're both distinctive men, but it's interesting that both of them did not see themselves as conservatives in a Burkean sense.
Yeah, no, it has certainly been popular, perhaps for the last century, to wear your liberalism on your sleeve. That's a Nathan Penkovsky term. He said you can get ahead in academia if you wear your liberalism on your sleeve. Now, go ahead.
It's a good point. A social conservative just cannot function in academia. You cannot be opposed to gay marriage and have a faculty appointment at a university in North America. However, you can be a libertarian economist. You can be Tyler Cowen, or a libertarian law professor. Libertarianism participates in the open society consensus. It's a radical expression of the open society consensus, as opposed to anyone who is a representative of what I call the strong gods is an enemy of the open society consensus. And, that consensus is really, really strong. Although it's weakening and it's losing its grip on the popular imagination, but no alternative has emerged to take its place. The populism is mostly negative. That is to say, it's mostly about rejecting the consequences of the open society consensus. No one's emerged as given a kind of winsome account of the kind of world we want to live in, where strong loyalties and, maybe Yoram Hazony, I think, and to pioneer some account, his book, The Virtue of Nationalism, he recognizes that we lack a positive, and he's working on that. And so it's a volatile time, culturally and politically.
So I'm interrupting you. I'm raising my hand. You've given me too many jumping off points, Professor. You just keep putting these shiny objects that I want to talk about that. So just I'll be as brief as possible. Karl Popper, first, thank you for putting up with studying his Open Society in detail. I find that book difficult to get excited about, but you did the work for us, so thank you. And that's what you've summarized here. Friedrich Hayek, I have to come to his defense a tiny bit. I'm glad you said that he's actually a more nuanced thinker than perhaps we give him credit for. I love his essay on the knowledge problem, or his thinking on the knowledge problem, and how we can never know enough. And even if we could know enough, there's no one smart enough to process all that knowledge. And so there are a few phrases that he uses where he says, well, actually, we're stuck with relying on tradition. And Daniel Mahoney actually brings this out in some of his writing, where he says, well, Hayek has a lot more conservatism in him than you realize. And then the third point, and I'll let you respond, you mentioned globalism and citizens of the world. And I thought that was a beautiful link to talk about universalism versus particularism. And so I love to ask my Catholic friends. I'm from a Protestant background, but love my Catholic friends, and so jealous. I wish we had actually some Catholic social teaching on the Protestant side. We're pretty weak on that side, notwithstanding some of the things you've written in your past life. But if you could comment on liberalism, universalism versus particularism, because on the one hand, we don't like the universalism of we're going to make the world safe for democracy. I think that's a Wilsonian term, and they're going to bomb Iraq and set up elections, and then a free market will blossom. And particularism that kind of comes across as an offense to not just the left and the liberals, but some of my Catholic friends have said, yeah, Shawn, I don't really like that idea of particularism. I'm more of a universalist. So I wonder if you could dilate on or share your thoughts on where you land on this tension of universalism and particularism vis-a-vis your theological background and then also liberalism. So take it wherever you want. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, 2 + 2 = 4 is a universal truth. So one no sort of serious intellectual will deny that there are universals. And Christianity is universal. I mean, go forth and baptize, go to all the nations and baptize in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. But Christianity is anchored in the person of Jesus Christ, and so and that's the scandal and the stumbling block. Mm-hmm. So the universal is he will concentrate it in the person of Christ, and so Christianity has both poles, and Catholicism also reflects both poles. So political universalism is not the same as a spiritual universalism. To want all things to fall under the lordship of Christ is not the same as to want all things to be governed by a single lawgiver. And, I was very much influenced as a young man by Vladimir Solovyev's More Progress and the End of History dialogue that ends with the tale of the Antichrist. And the Antichrist is the world governor who promises peace, world peace, and prosperity. And when it's Kozyev's universal and homogeneous state that I think is, in fact, a dream, a certain kind of technocratic dream. And it's real. Artificial intelligence is only going to stoke that fantasy because people will have the hope that it will solve the information problem that Hayek identified, and we won't need tradition. We'll just need super intelligence. But that, again, I think my opposition in the book is to the kind of political universalism. Always treats particular loves as a threat to achieving that grandiose dream.
So, quote on page 130, quote, when talking to a smart graduate student in Cambridge, Massachusetts, doing work on social policy, I was not surprised to discover that he could not formulate a reason to give preference to an unemployed worker in Ohio over someone in Senegal who wants to migrate to the United States, end quote. so that you're bringing out this issue of particularity. And yeah, so sorry to interrupt. Keep going.
I mean, one has a duty of charity that is global in scope, to be sure. I think that is a correct interpretation of the Christian imperative to love your neighbor as yourself. However, there's an order to our loves, and we have a greater duty to our near neighbor than we have to our far neighbor. And one would never say of a parent that the parent is a greater Christian for, inviting people into it to live in his home and making his children destitute and strangers in their own home. And, and the same is the case for political leader or a person in responsibility who fails to serve the needs of those who are near in order to complement his moral vanity by serving those who are giving preference to those who are far away. And so Mrs. Jellyby in Charles Dickens, that's a kind of a famous figure. And which is that? Which will have?
Is that in Pickwick or?
No, it's Mrs. Jellyby is in Bleak House.
Oh, right.
Her children, she neglects her children to serve the Hottentots, the cause of the Hottentots in South Africa.
Right. So again, Professor, you're dropping way too many exciting points. You mentioned universal homogeneous state, which you have we could allude to the Kantian desire for a global, a universal global economy. George Grant, Canadian philosopher, of course, we have to bring in a bit of Canadian content where it exists. He was worried about the universal homogeneous state. And then you're alluding to Ordo Amoris, I think, which I didn't do enough preparation on. So I'm not going to ask you questions there. But I mentioned all that because that leads us to the end of your book. In the end of your book, you talk about Return of the Strong Gods. We're not going to talk about the thesis of that because in part we've touched on it, but also because I want to bring out one aspect that ties into the post-liberalism and the critiques of post-liberalism. So at the end of the book, page 156, you're talking about how liberal theories shape our political imaginations. And you say this, quote, "They are called liberal because they seek to identify a basis for loyalty in self-interest," end quote. And then you talk about the political we, or what holds us together. For Hobbes, it was to secure my person. For Locke, it was to secure my property. We need freedom of thought and action. I wonder if you could dilate on the idea of the political we, or the pre-political we, as Roger Scruton would say, and whether or not, so Paul Kelly, he starts attacking the post-liberals as saying, oh, you guys just reduce everything to self-interest. Come on, you're simplistic in your thinking. And I don't see that in your book. But yet if we read only that one line of your book, they are called liberal because they seek to identify a basis for civic loyalty and self-interest, full stop. If we only take that one line of Professor Reno, then it seems like that's what you're saying. The main problem with liberalism is self-interest, and so we need to get rid of the whole thing. So dilate on this idea of self-interest, and then maybe even respond to the people who attack post-liberal thinking by reducing it to nothing but an attack on self-interest. Go ahead.
I mean, obviously, liberal projects have sought liberations of various sorts. The early stages of liberalism were efforts to, somebody like Hobbes was concerned about the sort of theological passions that led to the English Civil War. And he wanted to theorize civic life in a way to put that outside of the civic realm. And, maybe he was right to do that, but then you start to have a problem. Liberals always have the problem of trying to explain why I should be loyal to the we. Because all liberal projects are efforts to weaken, in some sense, the coercive power of the we, whether it's political power, something like the First Amendment of the American Constitution, is those rights are to protect us from the power of the state. Or if you have John Stuart Mill and on liberty, he recognizes that the social consensus is a more powerful tool of coercion than is mere political power. And so a great deal of modern liberalism in the 20th century is ordered towards weakening the power of the social consensus. We get civil rights, and civil rights are rights against society. They're not rights against the state. Strictly speaking, that's why they're called civil rights other than just political rights. And so, there we have a whole elaborate system of law to protect people who are minorities of various sorts from social censure or the judgment of the majority. And in any instance of that, we might look back and say, that was good. That was for the best. It led to greater freedom. It made society more dynamic, whatever you want to do. But you're always going to have to return as a political theorist, which is what Locke and Hobbes do. As a political theorist, deep thinkers, okay, now, but what, upon what can we refound the we? Now that we've marginalized or in some sense weakened the traditional forms, where can we turn to renew social solidarity? And, and in both cases, they want protection of preservation of life, my life, Hobbes, and preservation of property for Locke, or with maybe some general principle of utility, or for someone like Rawls, it's the original position. But the original position really is an appeal to self-interest. You just don't know where you're going to land in society. So wouldn't you want a society that is particularly solicitous to people who are in the minority, who are on the margins? And so, and that's not a fault. It doesn't mean that political liberals found their policies or their own political commitments on their own self-interest. That would be absurd. Many are very selfless in their commitments to these various projects of liberation. But as a theoretical matter, it becomes difficult. You have to ultimately, the individualism latent in liberalism becomes more evident when you turn to this theoretical question. And the theoretical question is, what is the source of solidarity? And I think the main problem with what we face right now is that we've inherited, as Nathan Pekoski said, you can wear liberalism on your sleeve. It's the default, has many forms, has many dimensions. It's the default assumption of what the good view is. But liberalism itself does not have powerful tools for generating solidarity. And I believe we live in a time when the crisis is not lack of freedom, although that certainly occurs in some instances. The big crisis, the meta crisis of our time, is one of disintegration. And in a time of disintegration, you have to turn to whatever provides solidarity. And it's not going to be, the sources for that are not going to be within liberalism.
I heard you on a podcast say the issue is our crisis of solidarity. And I thought, I've got to steal that term. That's wonderful. Maybe, and then I was debating, do I reference Professor Reno or not? And then lo and behold, I look at your book lying on my stack of books and the big bold writing on the back of your book on the strong gods, quote, "Our crisis of solidarity," end quote. And really that's the theme that you bring out in your whole book on Return of the Strong Gods.
So I think it's more acute in Canada than it is in the United States, which is, what in the world does it mean to be a Canadian? And I think it's always been a bit of a question. It's a perennial question throughout the modern era for all different countries. And I think the answer that somebody like Trudeau is particularly clear about this, Justin Trudeau. We are united in being a multicultural nation. So we're united. What does it mean to be Canadian? To be a Canadian means not to worry about what it means to be Canadian. If I might put it in a sort of way. We have this form in the United States as well. Barack Obama often said, diversity is our strength. So what are we united in doing? We're united in building a diverse country. And so you turn the problem into the solution. And liberalism in general, it can generate solidarity. I mean, there can be tremendous solidarity in the pursuit of certain freedoms. So we want to break down racial discrimination. I think this was a uniting project in the 60s and 70s among, not among a lot of white Southern Americans, but among a large portion. And now the United States look back, and that's part of our mythology. Martin Luther King Jr., he winds up being Abraham Lincoln, and, so we honor ever greater expansion of freedom. But there's a limit to that, it seems to me. And it can generate solidarity. And that's the sense in which Kelly's correct for any kind of facile dismissal of liberalism. But it's a kind of solidarity in weakening the traditional forms of solidarity. So it's a very paradoxical project. In my view, too, on the view I'm promoting as well, I think, which is that a culture of freedom requires a strong culture of freedom requires people who are profoundly loyal to higher truths, because that gives them the power to say, no, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to accept this.
Okay, I gotta cut you off there, because you're taking all the content for our last section on multiculturalism. So this is fantastic. A few thoughts. Yeah, I love Roger Scruton's line of talking about the pre-political we, and you even reference Scruton in your book. The other thought that comes to mind, I wrote in the margin here of your book, is Kenneth Minogue's work on the liberal mind. I believe it was 1963. And he really brings out, in a philosophical way, on the element of desire and will as being a linchpin in liberal thought. And I think that expands on your ideas about self-interest. But in the preface, or an updated preface that he wrote for his book, I think it was in the 70s, he wrote another foreword or preface. Maybe it was even later than that. He emphasized the essence of a liberal mind as being one wedded to skepticism and sentimentality. So it aligns with your ideas of weakening, and then yet concern for everybody everywhere, and your Dickens character worried about the Hottentots but not caring about her kids. And so it's not just Professor Reno saying this. Lots of other people are in agreement with you, and I don't think they would identify themselves as post-liberals. So it looks like you're thinking you're going to say something. Go ahead.
Well, I think, post-liberal, that's a like neoliberal. It seems to be something that you can't avoid, but it's extremely amorphous. I thought the book by Paul Kelly, and then there's a kind of companion book that came out for polity by
Matt Sleet.
Yeah, Matt Sleet. I think both of them did a good job of pointing out that there are different strands of post-liberalism.
Yeah, give us your taxonomy if you have one, or I can read you what Matt Kelly said here. Paul Kelly. He said national populism, common good communitarianism, and common good absolutism. So he summarized it into just those three: national populism, common good communitarianism, and common good absolutism. Did you like his taxonomy, or did you think it's reductionistic again?
Taxonomies are always somewhat reductionistic. But you need to be aware. That was helpful. Yeah. I didn't have any objection to that. I would say that I did a PhD in theology in the 1980s at Yale University, and one of my teachers published a book called what was it called? But the subtitle is it The Grammar of Faith? But the subtitle is Theology in a Post-Liberal Age, and the term post-liberal was applied to his and my other teachers' theological views. And what this was a recognition on my teachers that the liberal theological project had reached a kind of dead end, and that it had disintegrated the subject matter of theology. one of the teachers, Hans Frey, wrote a book called Eclipse of Biblical Narrative. And he showed how the kind of historical critical project had kind of atomized New Testament into pericopes and sources and what was happening, the Pauline community. And so the actual text itself, the story of Jesus from Annunciation to resurrection, was kind of lost. That's a very powerful book, actually, and pretty convincing in that regard. And then my other teacher, George Lindbeck, did the theological projects, the liberal age, and the anti-liberal projects of fundamentalism, that also wound up turning attention away from the actual subject matter of theology, which is what the church has said and teaches, the language of the church. So that's, to me, the post-liberal term is important because it says that whatever future we're heading towards, it's not one that is going to be an altar and throne restoration. And that, just like my teachers at Yale, that the reactionary theology, the theology that defines itself against liberal theology, participates in the same sort of thought world, in a kind of mirror image. And similarly, a certain kind of de Maestrian or Schmittian reactionary thing participates in the disenchanted world of modern political liberalism. So for me, post-liberalism is helpful. It's very frustrating because post doesn't really tell you where you're going, but it does signal to people that whatever future we have, it's not going to be a future without liberalism. Right? I don't want a future without the First Amendment of the American Constitution, which is the sort of pinnacle of it epitomizes the essential liberal element of the American experiment.
So
but I do want. I look back and said, well, gee, we had a country with the First Amendment back when we had school prayer for public school children. Like, were we not living in America? Was that a world that was illiberal? Now, according to certain Supreme Court decisions and consensus of almost every law professor, is that school prayer would be profoundly illiberal. Well, wait a minute. If we had a liberal society with school prayer, why can't we experiment with something like that again?
Right. So this is beautiful. You're tying it in nicely to where I was hoping to end up with the multiculturalism, theological presuppositions, secularism. Ferenc Horscher, a Hungarian philosopher I've talked with several times. Perhaps you've seen him around.
Yeah, I know her.
Yeah. So Professor Horscher says, Shawn, I have no trouble at all with liberals. He said, I as long as they're actually liberals. And so he emphasizes that, or he takes an appreciative inquiry approach to liberalism and simply says, well, this is what it is. These are the great things it offers. And like most theories and ideas, sets of ideas that we come up with, it doesn't have the resources within itself to address some of our thorniest problems we're facing today, with the crisis of solidarity, to use your term. And so that's not to say we hate liberalism. We're just saying we need something a little more. And now, is that a fair way to capsulize Professor Reno's thinking on liberalism? It's good, but not enough.
It was never enough. I mean, war making, there's nothing in liberal, war making is not a liberal project. Going to war, I mean, anybody who served in the Army knows that this is a profoundly illiberal environment. The command and control and mobilizing a country to go to war. I mean, it was the most Japanese internment. People look back and say terrible, 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 but emblematic of the fact that war making requires marshaling social forces towards a single purpose. And that is not liberalism at all. Liberalism can help you avoid excess in that project, but it cannot define it or be its animating core. And so similarly, Frank Orkart I agree with him. If the crisis is one of solidarity, liberalism just doesn't have these powerful tools that allow you to unite people around a common cause and identity. And, we see this problem with immigration. Liberalism you can give some account. Liberals are not completely unable to give an account about limiting immigration. They can give it, but it's always a very second, third order justification for limiting immigration.
Yeah.
And so, if you're a nationalist, it's easy to come up with a reason to, America for Americans, Canada for Canadians. Well, where's the justification for that? Well, if you're a certain kind of view of the strong gods, the fact of the country is a sufficient reason. The liberal says, no, it has to be justified.
Yeah.
And, to which I would say, I'm not convinced. That is the justification. The fact of the country, its history, its legacy, its heritage.
Yeah. So I'm glad that you brought out the concept of war, conflict. Again, I like the way George Grant puts it. He says conflict or contest, it's always at the margins of our political discussion. He says we shouldn't situate it in the center of everything we talk about. But inevitably, people bring in Carl Schmitt, and Matt Sleet has a whole section on, he said, post-liberalism as Schmittian enemy. And so they love to wield Schmitt and say, well, you guys are just a bunch of Schmittian
authoritarians in the making. I think that, if you'll permit another digression, I think in the 50s, in the aftermath of World War II, there were two strands of analysis of the origins of totalitarianism. And Hannah Arendt wrote a book called The Origins of Totalitarianism, and she represents the view that an atomized mass, that modernity atomizes, it destroys traditional forms of belonging and atomizes people, making them very vulnerable to demagogues. And so she thought that a kind of restoration of institutions and sense of belonging, that we use my language, kind of restoration of some of the strong gods, is the way to prevent the return of totalitarianism. And someone like Isaiah Berlin, on the opposite side, totalitarianism are these strong loves, and we need to have a worldview that weakens across the board. And so, for him, Plato, as was the case for Karl Popper, is the kind of monistic bad guy. But boy, I tell you, if you think Plato is the bad guy, then basically almost the entire Western philosophical tradition winds up being.
Yeah, no, I'm not a Straussian, but I love his concept of a cave beneath a cave. It seems like a big part of the modern project is we create a cave beneath a cave. We eliminate huge aspects of reality, which you say have come rushing back with the return of the strong gods. And so it's undermining the whole cave beneath the cave that Strauss pictured. That was his word picture to describe a significant element of what we're going through in 20th century reality. At least that's my understanding of it. But I'd like to pick up on your comment about school prayer, because that links to Bill 21. So you said, we had school prayer, we had a liberal society. What was the big problem? And one of the features that comes out in this project from Cardis, it's called The Nation in the Veil. They talk about how there was no need for a Bill 21, so state-enforced secularism, in the 1960s. And yet the Catholic Church was much stronger in Quebec at that time. But no one thought, we need to have a bill to enforce this approach to, policemen can't have any religious symbols, teachers can't have any religious symbols, get the crucifixes out of all the buildings. And yet today, Quebec is fighting for almost a decade now, since 2019, over exactly this issue. So just very briefly, Bill 21 uses the state to enforce laïcité. Laïcité is not directly translatable into the term secularism. It actually has four aspects of it. So they talk about a separation of religion and state, not just church and state, neutrality in the public sphere, equality of opinion and equality for people, and then freedom of conscience. But again, freedom of conscience in a French understanding of it. So it was explained to me that from a French perspective, we're talking more about freedom of thought as opposed to a Protestant rooted tradition where you're talking about freedom of conscience as freedom of moral conscience. So it's your freedom to think versus freedom to believe in a moral sense. And then in France, they have a fifth element of emancipation. So just because you're born into a particular a Catholic family doesn't mean the child has to stay that way. But the reason I list those for you is something that comes out incredible complexity, that you can't understand the debate about laïcité or secularism in Quebec unless you understand the political theology that derives from a Catholic viewpoint and even a French Catholic viewpoint, not even the Roman Catholic, but France has its own unique approach to it, which we see mirrored in Quebec to a great deal, versus a Anglo-American liberal democratic or Anglo-American Protestant set of presuppositions. And I'll give you one example and then you can take it away. So the Catholic heritage, politically, people were more worried about religion having power over the state. We can't let the church take control of the state. Whereas the Protestant heritage, as I've been told, and you're going to correct this if I have it wrong, the Protestant heritage is more worry about the state imposing itself on religion. We don't want the state telling us what to do. All of us Protestants are going to keep splitting churches, and now we have 40,000 different denominations. And so it's the same players in the contest, but the worry is placed on a different player. For the Catholic heritage, that national heritage, you're worried more about the church taking control of the state. And people coming from a Protestant theological background, you're worried more about the state imposing itself on religion. So we don't have to dive into the complexities of just the Catholic versus Protestant, but I thought that was a nice example or test case of, if we can't even solve that, how on earth are we going to look in the political theology of all the other cultures we're bringing in and all of their political assumptions? So given your background as a theologian and a political philosopher, do you think this is where the money lies? Is this what we should be talking about, political theology, when we look at multiculturalism? Or do you think it's interesting, but it still doesn't really get to the heart of it? So go take it away. What do you think about multiculturalism and political theology?
Bill 21 is not worried about the state. It's worried about society. I think that's not the case that the state is telling people what to think.
Absolutely. So the
state doesn't have instruments with which to do that, but schools do.
Well, it's worried about, so the salience of primarily Islam and its political cachet and ability to organize and impose itself upon the state, that so much so that the state says, okay, no, we're actually going to take the approach that's been taken in France with laïcité, and we're just going to make it a state-enforced, legislated position. Now, in the 1960s, it was actually the left that was promoting laïcité because they didn't like Christianity. No, let's be secular. Now, today, the left is actually saying, oh, no, we don't like laïcité. People should be allowed to wear their religious symbols if they're police officers, or wear their hijabs in the classroom, etc. I only raise it, though, again, not to go too deep into the details of Bill 21 and laïcité, but do you think it's a reasonable example or specimen that we can look at and say, wow, there's so many difficulties baked into just the Quebec issue and Catholic versus Protestant. How on earth will the multicultural project ever work? The complexity magnifies with each new culture that you bring in with its own political theology. Now, do you think I'm putting too much emphasis on political theology? I mean, this is your background. Is it kind of a niche area? And yeah, Shawn, most people don't think about it anymore these days. Or do you think there's an opportunity to think more about it? Go ahead.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Certainly, one of the paradoxes of a multicultural society is that the multiculturalism is sold as a kind of greater freedom because we have all of this. People can, as you said, your freedom of thought and so on, but it requires ever more management and intervention to preserve. And so diversity in the American context is interesting that you're trained in diversity. So if you take if your Human Resources Department subjects people to diversity training. So that's a very interesting term. You have to be trained in it because it's something that is kind of confected. It's something that is created and preserved and managed. So there's a close connection between the technocratic mindset and the ideals of multiculturalism. They're very closely related to each other. But I think, exactly the Quebec context and predecessor with the French laïcité movement and the laws of 1905 in France. The worry wasn't that Catholicism would control the state. The worry was that Catholicism would control the people, and through the people control the state. And that's clearly what the anxiety is. And it would take, we're not at the cusp of, in Montreal the problem is not that it's on the cusp of becoming like Iran. The problem is that, growth in the number of Muslims who adhere to Sharia law changes the social character of the city. And it's quite natural in a democratic society for a changed social character to manifest itself in new laws and new requirements and new regulations. So it seems to me that the political leadership of Quebec is anxious to stymie this social change and to prevent or somehow cabinet and cordon it off so that, and this winds up being a kind of crazy complex thing. We want to celebrate difference, but we want to neutralize it as much as possible. Yeah. So it's a weird thing, we're celebrating, Canada. It's our greatness as a nation is that we are a multicultural nation, but God forbid that any of those cultures should exercise influence over our civic life. In any kind of meaningful way.
Yeah.
Well, God forbid that that the minarets should become too high. So I think this is, it seems to me that what my book is arguing is that the way forward is to nurture the pre-political we that the Muslim in Montreal, when the secular, great-grandson of the Catholic in Montreal understand themselves to be united in a common project and shared love. And that is what will hold things together as these inevitable conflicts and tensions are worked out. And that the attempt to sort of legally and minutially, like whether or not you can wear a cross if you're a school teacher, that this is not going to, you might be able to create a little bit of breathing room with these mechanisms to give space for the we to reemerge, but it's certainly not going to work long term. Can't micromanage people like that. That's a form kind of totalitarianism.
Yeah. So I'm glad that you brought out that nuance about controlling the people versus controlling the state and tying it back into a we, because that's another theme in this larger project that I alluded to, was the difference between republicanism and how people see themselves as, going all the way back to Roman Republic. We're actually we're members of a republic, and we need civic virtue so that we can be involved in civic responsibility. And for the French background is more that mindset, very much in the country of France, the republicanism. And so the example that of the person, the researcher I was speaking to, she said it's very different from even a census. We put a liberal assumption on a census is to ask your race, your gender, your background, your age, your everything. So it's all detailed descriptions of the individual. Whereas a Republican mindset is to say, no, you're actually a member of the Republic, and these are the civic virtues that we expect of you. And so this difference between republicanism and liberalism is animating the tensions in Quebec. And it touches on, again, what you've raised in your book about how do we understand the we, and how do we understand our responsibilities within the we. Does civic virtue even exist if liberalism is all there is? I'm rambling. I don't know if that sparked a thought for you.
Republicanism, there's a race, there's a thing, there's a public thing, a res publica. So there is something, and it's not an aggregation of all of the I's. It is a we, and it has a life. It's a mystical body, not in the supernatural sense that the church is a mystical body, but in a natural sense. That it's a strong God in my terminology. It exists, it's real, it has transcendent power. It tugs at our hearts, it demands our loyalty. And that is the engine of civic virtue, is that the love that we have for the thing. Part of it, or in my book, I have this whole fun thing I did with Jacques Derrida. We have the post-war consensus was very anti-metaphysical. And it's just, people are baffled. I mean, I go to for academics and political philosophers. They just what do you mean there's a thing called America? I mean, well, where does it live? Point to it so you can have some sort of empiricist argument that it doesn't really exist, or it's just a linguistic construct. And, at some point, again, we're back to what I said about the nation. Someone says to me, well, wait a minute, what justifies your giving preference to your children? Well, because they're my children. But, well, wait a minute, you got to justify them. They say, no, that's the foundation of justifying many things. It is not itself something that I need to justify. I might contemplate it to understand it more deeply, to enter into that truth more deeply, the reality of my paternal identity as a father. And same thing as an arrogant citizen. I certainly want to think about it, understand it, enter into it, contemplate it. But the notion that I have to, it's not real until I can prove it or justify it, it just strikes me as, no, it is more certain than the things that I would appeal to justify it.
So it sounds like you're a Platonist, where the whatness of the thing is not contained. Is that correct? Go ahead.
I've become more of a Platonist as I've gotten older. I agree with you. It's very interesting that I think I've been aware over the last decade. I do sound an awful lot like Platonist, don't I? And I said, maybe that's just the right way to go.
So So I love it. I love it. And that's a whole nother, we don't have time to discuss that because Aristotelianism seems to be so popular right now, especially amongst the post-liberal thinkers. And yet for you to start talking about the whatness of the thing is not contained within the thing itself. And oh, this is delightful. So I'm looking forward to, anyways.
I think that the, I think that the civic we participates in both the supernatural we of the church and in the more fundamental and more powerful natural we of the family. That these are the, again, you could think in nuanced ways about how they're different. And you should think about that. And I'm not so impressed. I'm more the person who sees Aristotle and Plato kind of plowing the same field rather than working at odds with each other. I mean, the notion of a final end is immobilizes reality and gives it the dynamic character that I think is part of the appeal of Plato, to recognize that we live in a world that draws us towards things, evokes from us to live a certain way. Where it's not an immobile, inert and dead thing. That the world we live in is a living thing.
Yeah.
We rightly are repelled by things and we're rightly attracted by things.
Yeah. No, I love that. So yes, I agree. We need the telos and we need a logos, or an animating body of logic to apply our methodos. So getting too Greek here on us, I guess, but we need all of it. If we only focus on an extreme emphasis on a telos, a common good conservatism as an objectively verifiable, that was a quote, objectively demonstrable concept of the good, is one thing that came out of this research project I was alluding to. That's a particular way of thinking about politics versus what you're bringing up, where, yeah, just because I can't prove to you what the res publica is, doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It does exist.
We, in the United States, Canada, the country is not the one I grew up in many ways. It's changed. Demographically, it's dramatic. I mean, we reached peak homogeneity. And I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland. It was a black-white country. And the race divide was definitive. Yeah. And now 15% of people living in the United States were not born here. It is a much more multicultural society. So the res publica is shifting and changing. And it's the challenge of our political leaders, and all of us as citizens, to try to think and work towards what is the we going to look like and feel like for the 21st century. Yeah. And what my book is hostile to is the notion that we don't have to do that, or somehow it's illiberal or wicked to entertain that project. And like I said, I think we live in a nihilistic. The threat is disintegration and nihilism. I think I was not surprised that the Supreme Court signed off on. I think the Supreme Court will sign off on the Ten Commandments in public schools. Why is that? It's because it's really not realistic to think that children are being threatened by this overbearing Christian consensus. On the contrary, we have school shootings and things like that. They seem to be swallowed in by this profoundly nihilistic culture. Maybe a little symbol in the classroom that there are truths that are universal. There are moral truths. Maybe that would have a positive effect on young people. So I predict the Supreme Court, it's not a left-right, but I predict the Supreme Court will uphold that Louisiana, I think now Oklahoma and Texas law, those laws, because they know that we're not living in the 1960s, yeah, in the shadow of this kind of, they rush back to the churches in the 50s, the bourgeois middle class consensus that is so oppressive, and punitive and all those sorts of things. That was my mother's world. And, for some reason at age 66, I'm very aware of that as a baby boomer, that I inherited a very stable and sort of metaphysically dense world that I could then experiment in, open up and make it more plastic and flexible. Mm-hmm. But at the end of that process, we're passing on to young people a society that has no metaphysical density whatsoever.
Yeah, you had...
They're swimming in this liquid world with no possibility of finding any dry land.
Yeah, you had something to rebel against.
Yes. Yeah. And I did some rebelling, but I was, even as a 20-year-old, aware of that. As I told people, the worst of the 60s was actually the 70s.
All you rock climbers are kind of hippies smoking drugs, aren't you? Or
no, that was what got me out. It's like, you smoke pot because you're bored as a teenager. And when I got to Yosemite and people were smoking pot, I was like, whoa, there's something wrong here. This is, you're doing what you love. Why would you want to do that? That would turn me off to marijuana was actually rock climbing.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, so Professor Reno's not a hippie. Anyways, your book is brilliant. Everybody needs to have it on their shelf. We could continue, but Return of the Strong Gods, Nationalism, Populism, and the Future of the West. Professor Reno, it's been such a pleasure to have you here today.
Great to be on the show.